his granddaughter. I have to lean in to hear him over the too loud music as he tells us his story. He tells us that he worked a job for many, many years, many decades in fact, until his son had a daughter of his own. That was the moment that he finally realized that the futures of those he loved were in jeopardy and that financially providing for them couldn't be enough anymore. That was the moment that he took his nose out of his books and he started to explore. After many internet searches and many emails, he found a climate organization to volunteer with, a rare outlet for processing climate anxiety. It's actually been over a decade since then. His granddaughter is now preparing to enter high school, and as he looks at her now, his eyes start to cloud. And the grandfather and the granddaughter don't break eye contact as he chokes back tears and says, "I do this for you." Hello, my name is Rueff, and today I'll be sharing with you a couple of stories to help you understand your impact too. We're going to start in April, otherwise known as Earth Day of 2022, and we'll work our way to the present. Let's begin. For our next story, I'm actually going to need some audience participation, so prepare yourselves. Basically, when I say, "Rise up, get down," I need you to say, there we go, "There's a people's movement in this town." All right, are you ready? Let's go. Rise up, get down. My throat is sore and I can hardly get out another sentence as I raise my megaphone to the sky one last time as the hundreds of marchers gather before me in City Hall. I cry, "Rise up, get down." Suddenly, it's over. The crowd dissolves before me and I start to clean up. It is Earth Day after all. And as I'm wandering through the crowds, someone stops me. She identifies herself as a mother. She tells me how scared she is for change, how scared she is for the future of her child. She knows that burning gas in her home will raise her child's risk of asthma, but it's more complicated than that. There are barriers: time, money, and the reason left unsaid: vulnerability. It takes vulnerability to admit that for reasons often beyond your control, you are not perfect, the world is not perfect, and that what you need is not always something you may get. But it takes a risk to ask. It takes vulnerability to start that conversation, and starting a conversation will only bring us closer to a solution. It is my belief that our ability to and our willingness to be vulnerable will solve the climate crisis. Let me explain. It is now September. I'm at the Baylands, and I'm collecting trash with a couple of other volunteers when suddenly we pass by this fence. My co-organizer, who grew up in the area, stops us at this fence, and she guides our eyes to the factory that once towered behind that fence. She tells us how it polluted her town, how it smogged her skies and poisoned their waters for decades, how citizens fought for years to be heard by their politicians, but how it took years too for those citizens to become neighbors, to become community, until at last their voices were loud enough to be heard over environmental racism and other injustices, until that factory was shut down. It is vulnerable to let yourself believe in a better future. It is sometimes a privilege, however, to let yourself believe in your own ability to affect that future. I recognize that I have this privilege, but I recognize too that there are others who come from different resources than I that may also have more control than they may sometimes let themselves believe. Okay, so call me naive or overly optimistic, but I've seen the power that a few individuals can have. I saw it at this event. This event actually was prolonged by a conversation with one of the volunteers. At the time, she was incredibly new to our Student Climate Coalition, and until that point, had been incredibly quiet. But after that community member took the time to be vulnerable and share a story from her community, this volunteer began to use her voice too. And because of this, she today has helped deepen the dialogue and strengthen the community that we sparked that day. It was because of that vulnerability. From all of this, I have learned that it is easier to affect change and drive a better future when there are others to affect and drive that change with you. But in this world, it's sometimes difficult to find an intersection between making change and, well, making change, money. So now it's December, it's 11 p.m., and I'm wandering through a neighborhood with one of my friends. We're talking about our hopes and dreams for the future, as, yes, even teenagers sometimes do. When all of a sudden, we realize that she doesn't know why she wants to do what she wants to do so strongly. I've had this conversation before. In this community, we are raised to think that it is dangerous to not have a plan for the future. In my opinion, though, it is more dangerous to not have a reason for the future. You can spend your whole life just doing what you're good at and what you'll be paid enough to do without ever driving meaningful change to affect the futures of those you love. I believe there's a sense of emptiness to this. I believe that that emptiness can lead us on a path to accumulating stuff in an effort to fill an entirely different gap. There are some, however, who have managed to find a different path. They've blended their careers with sustainability in a way that is still too infeasible for most to do. Even if they don't work directly in environmentalism, they may be paid to make their company more sustainable or just unrelatedly add just 1% of sustainability to their careers. Whatever it is, they have found a way to find an intersection between what they're good at and what the world, what their community, what their loved ones need most from them. A livable future. Okay, so it's now the end of December, and we're back at that cafe with that grandfather and his granddaughter. If you remember, that grandfather had spent over a decade now in municipal climate action. And as he turns to his granddaughter, his heart full of love, all he says is, "I do this for you." And the little girl doesn't need him to say anymore. She understands. She's already been an activist in her own right. In fact, when you see the same scene an hour later, you'll see us deep in conversation, exploring ways for her to deepen and expand her activist journey. It was his vulnerability that brought us here today and made that conversation possible. I went home that night, and I cried. I cried because I couldn't help but think of my own family, especially my grandfather. He majored in history. It's his favorite thing to do. He loves collecting and sharing stories. I do too, but I'm still getting a hang of the telling part. But he and my grandmother, though, they worked in purchasing for decades in order to put food on the table for my family. It wasn't until he retired that he was able to make the change that he wanted to make the most. Now, he's in his late 80s, so it's a little bit more difficult for him to get out every day. So instead, quite often actually, I receive in the mail a bunch of newspaper clippings and articles about different climate events and policies and just anything my grandparents think I would enjoy. I get to have the impact that I want to see in the world because of the choices that they made. With that last story, I want to take a moment to reflect on everywhere we've come so far. First, though, I want to emphasize that I'm just one person with one perspective. But I hope that you at least listen to my opinion, because perhaps an aspect of it will resonate with and help inform your trajectory too. To put it simply, I believe that our connections are the most powerful thing that we have. I believe that it is always worth taking the time to understand the nuances behind a person's actions and their motivations. Sometimes they're harmonious, and other times there are barriers that cause them to disconnect. Either way, understanding an individual can only make it easier to drive change with them. I believe that every individual is capable of and should strive to drive change for the sake of their own futures and the futures of those they love and consider to be their community. Personally, I have found a way to drive this change through an intersection between my own interests and what I'm good at, with the caveat too, of course, that my interests are ever evolving, but that my core values rarely shift. Personally, I was dragged into my green team in freshman year, and that's where I first found my community. It wasn't until recently, though, when I was planning a climate summit with that grandfather I mentioned earlier and a couple of other amazingly talented individuals, that I found a way to improve the futures of that community. It actually wasn't until I was on the ground in that climate summit, solving problems left and right, that I realized that the people around me were learning, processing, and taking action on climate change all within the span of a few hours. It was life-changing. Since then, every day, I choose to help fellow youth and fellow people find their space in the climate community. And perhaps you will find your space here too. Or maybe you won't. Either way, I urge you to go home tonight and take a moment to reflect on where you've come from so far. Consider the futures of those you love, but feel may not get the futures that they deserve. I want you to think about them. I want you to cry about them. And I want you to let that momentum compel you. Talk to or text someone, read a book, an article, a webpage, visit YouTube, scroll through TEDx, or just write something, find a way to process, basically. I want you to find a way to process. Because regardless of where we're coming from, we're going to find a way to get through this, but only if we take action together. Now, if you decide that the change that you want to make is in climate change, there we go. I have a QR code and a tiny URL up on the screen right now. On it, there is a document with a ton of organizations to try out. I urge you to reach out to these organizations because they will provide you a community to talk to, listen, and learn from. I urge you to reach out to them because, simply put, I want you to rise up and get down because, say it with me, everyone, there's a people's movement in this town. Thank you.